Hello everybody. In this episode I'm kind of concluding my series on editing this video that we've been going over editing a short film. And we've done some cleanup on this thing, we've done some sound mixing, and now I'm going to be going over color grading. And color grading is kind of the overall process of not just fixing the colors and matching them from shot to shot, it's also kind of giving it a look, giving it a very specific filmic look or whatever you're going for. To kind of finalize your project. In fact, this footage here was shot on a red camera, and this footage tends to come across a little flat. This raw footage that we have here, this is not the actual red footage, but it was actually compressed, so I could kind of use these as exercise files for people to access and do the editing on and be able to follow along. If this was the raw data, you could access the raw data and tell. In fact, that's what I did to provide this footage. I intentionally made it very flat. I put it in red film log LUT to make it look very flat, to give it kind of a higher dynamic range before I exported these exercise files out. So this is very flat looking. First step we're going to do here, we're going to go through this in 3 steps. We're going to go through, first of all, what are called the scopes, and those are like actual arbitrary measurements that's been created by several standards committees based on detail loss and darks and highlights, saturation levels, hue levels, a whole bunch of different things dealing with color and brightness levels. Then after that, in the next episode, we're going to be going through the controls that you have with the color Lumetri panel. In fact, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up to color arrangement and get this arranged so you see, this is where when you go to color, you have the Lumetri color panel here, you have the scopes up here, and we're going to go through the scopes first, then we'll go through the panel, and then we're going to show actually how to grade this graded project, and some of the tips and tricks to get through getting a full grade on a project done. So first of all here, let's start going over the scopes. When you first bring this up, if you have never messed with the scopes, it will probably, by the way, I'm right-clicking in this area right here, and I'm going to check mark 2 other scopes that are going to pop up and show here. It will likely show all 5 of these scopes if you've never toggled these on and off. I'm going to move my mouse over this and hit tilde and show these scopes really quick. Let's go through the names of these scopes and basically what they do. First of all, 2 of them I'm not going to cover because, in my honest opinion, this here, the histogram, that's a vertical histogram, is a complete waste of space. This thing has a luminance channel that's superimposed over a blue channel, a green channel, and red channel, and it's just all smashed together when they could get way more real estate by going left to right. It's the way Resolve does it, and the scopes, the RGB histograms in Resolve are actually pretty useful. These ones in Adobe, in my opinion, fairly useless. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right-click on this, and I'm going to get rid of my histogram because we're not going to be going over that. Another one that's kind of weird that came from the speed grade days is this one right here, which is their HSL vector scope. Normally in just regular color grading, people are using this vector scope right here, which is just commonly known as a vector scope. They call it the YUV vector scope, and then this bottom one down here is called the HLS vector scope. I've looked up this a couple times online, and I can't really I can find some text information on it, but really no good visual information as to what it does. I've kind of messed with it, and it seems like it kind of deals a little bit with vibrance, from what I can tell, but aside from that, it's really tough to tell what this scope does. If you know what it does, let me know. I've been color grading for years. I've been using Resolve for years, and the only time I've ever seen this scope is in Premiere Pro. Well, speed grade first, and then they moved it to Premiere Pro. And I'm not knocking on their color grading system because for an editing software, they've got a really nice color grading system going on here. So I'm going to uncheck my HLS vector scope as well, and now we've got the 3 scopes up that are very useful: the waveform, the vector scope, and the RGB parade, or just commonly referred to as the parade. The way I usually like to arrange these things is exactly how they're arranged right now. I like the waveform first, the vector scope next, and then the parade down below, because this actually takes a waveform and spreads it across this whole bottom panel, which gives you a little bit more real estate for having this is actually 3 different scopes here, and it's spreading those 3 scopes across the bottom. If you had it crammed up here, it would be a lot more cramped, and it would be kind of hard to read. So if you do have these things arranged in a way that is not useful to you, let's uncheck a couple things here. So now watch, if I just have one scope here and I right click and I add, let's add our waveform here. And our waveform, look how it kind of makes this thing compact and squishes them down, and you don't have as much real estate for each one of these scopes here. This is red channel, green channel, blue channel. So what you can do is if you have it like this and you want this one down here, all you have to do is right click and uncheck the one that you want on the bottom, which is the parade here, and now right click and check it again, and since these ones have now become first, it put this one on the bottom. It does it from kind of top left to right to the bottom hierarchy there. All right, another thing I usually like to do, sometimes this waveform is not on Luma. Sometimes you'll see it on RGB, which has your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel blended all together. I kind of like to use my waveform, and you can use this down here for color and for color balance. I like to use, this is basically a composite of this, and this laid out, the red, green, and blue channel smashed over the top of each other, plus the luminance channel. I kind of like to just see my luminance channel here, and so I could really just work with brightness levels and contrast. So I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to go down to waveform type and tell it to just show the Luma waveform, which now just shows brightness levels. All right, so to go over the names of each one of these here, first of all, this is our waveform monitor, and the waveform monitor is used mostly and primarily for luminance. And by luminance, I mean brightness levels, I mean darks, highlights, whites, mids, which are your grays, anything that goes from black on a gradient to gray to white is the way you can kind of envision that. And this is a measurement of your image from left to right. So this image that we have up here right now, let's move over this one right here. As we move across the screen here, what the 0 does here, this is 0 IRE. This is measured on a scale of, it's called IREs. IRE is basically Institute of Radio Engineers. It is a standard and an arbitrary standard setup where they have defined where details disappear. First of all, at 0, this is where details disappear in the darks. So when things start to go black, and it goes so black that you no longer see detail or texture in it, that is what happens at 0 IRE. As you go up to 100, 100 is where details disappear in the opposites, in the highlights or the whites, in things that are white on your screen. If anything touches this up here, the details are starting to disappear and be crushed. Now 50 is what is considered 50% gray. That's perfectly in the middle of black and white, and you got this kind of mid-gray that even, in fact, they just call this mids, the mid-grays. Your image is measuring mid-grays. If we look at this image here and we start moving across, and all of a sudden there's this spike right here, it's like around 20 IRE, so it's kind of a dark gray, and all of a sudden this boosts up to 50 IRE, and then there's a little dip there in black, and then it boosts back up to 50 IRE. And look at this, your image here, as you move about that far over, all of a sudden you have this little brightness level right there, then the black level, and then the white level right there. So this is measuring your image from left to right, from right to left. As we move over, see, in fact, this lamp is about 3/4 of the way over. As we move over 3/4 of the way, and we move up, look at that bright highlight there going around 80 IRE. So that's bright. It's not quite losing detail yet, but it's close. And this lamp here is burning around, looks like around like 60 to 70 IRE, in between 60 and 70 IRE is what that lamp is burning at. So the waveform really tells you, first of all, what your kind of basic exposure is of your image. And just looking at this, overall, this looks like kind of a darker image. It's around, topping out around like 40, around 40 IRE, coming up to the mid-gray. So you have some properly exposed stuff in here, but not much. Everything's pretty lowly exposed in here. And also, another thing that I can tell from this is what's called contrast. Let's kind of mess around with the image over here. I'm going to move over to the side. We're going to get into the controls, but right now I'm just going to mess with this image right here and watch my waveform here. In fact, let's just bring up my waveform. And I'm going to grab the exposure and I'm going to boost this up. And look what's happening to our image. Our image is becoming brighter, but it's also getting kind of blown. It's getting blown out, and the texture is being blown out as well here. This has been intended to be a dark image. It was shot as a darker image. So if we keep that kind of dark there, watch what happens as I grab contrast and drag this over. Look at my waveform there. What that's doing is it's pushing the darks down while lifting the highlights up, and we're getting what's called contrast. That's where contrast is defined as the distance between your highlights and your darks. And when you spread those out, you get more contrast. As you pull them closer together, you get what's called a flat image. So this is looking very flat, and look at this is how this is flattened out, starting to pancake that image there. And you're getting a pancake. As they get closer and closer defined to each other, they're going to get closer to that mid-gray region, and they're going to be, and there's not much definition in here because everything is so closely defined in the same area. So to take that further apart, we get contrast. In fact, if we even go to our curves where we have a lot more power, and if we move everything basically to mid-grays here, move our darks to mid-grays and move our highlights to mid-grays, look what happens to our image. Our image becomes this mid-gray image, and everything is squashed together in this, so there is no definition in our image, no contrast. As we start pulling contrast out of it, as we start spreading these apart here, bringing the bottoms down and the highlights up, we start getting more definition in the image here. So if we really wanted to get contrast to this, we're going to get into this later, but we're going to show you how to do what's called an S-curve. This is an S-curve where you get a really nice kind of contrast curve to this image. There you go. See, that's before and after. So you guys are working with that flat footage, and then that's afterwards, after we add a little bit of contrast. All right, so that's what that scope is for, is measuring darkness levels, brightness levels, and make sure you're not losing detail. It shows where your mid-grays are and shows contrast as well. Let's go through our next scope here. Our vector scope YUV, or what's just normally called your vector scope. What the vector scope is this is a measurement of a color wheel here, the colors that exist in any image. I'm going to go to my color wheels down here, and this is basically a replica of these wheels down here. You've got these yellow points, green points, cyan, blue, magenta, red points, and this is all in the same geographical location as this wheel right here. What makes these colors be where they are on the wheel is basically what they call complementary colors. It's how far these colors are away from each other. These are actually opposite, or what they call complementary colors, things that are on the opposite side of the wheel. So if you go over here and you go from the greens and go across, you got magenta. If you have a lot of magenta, it's absent of green, and vice versa. If you have a lot of blue, it's absent of orange, and vice versa. So as you go from blue and move over to the opposite side of the wheel, you got yellow, red to cyan, green to magenta. These are opposite colors or complementary colors. And the reason why they call them complementary colors is I believe they actually complement each other when they're on screen. Oftentimes you'll see a bluish background with a very warm subject. So you have what's called the teal versus orange look, where you have orange on one side for the subject that's kind of this warmer look, and then the background is blue, kind of bluish and cold looking. So that makes this contrast that complements the image and makes you kind of pay attention more to the subject. So this is a basic, what they call hue wheel. This vector scope measures the hue of your image, shows you where you have concentrations of specific colors. Right here we've got a heavier concentration of reds and yellows here, kind of pushing out towards the reds and yellows. And the further it gets out from this midpoint right here is representative of what we call saturation. Now, hue is the basic color that you're dealing with within an image. If you have a very blue sky, you've got a blue hue. If you've got green leaves, you've got a green hue. If you've got a red shirt, you've got a very red hue. So just depending on what colors you have in the image, that's your hue. Now, your saturation will have the exact same hue. It's not changing the hue, but it's changing the intensity of the hue. So saturation is intensity, whereas hue is just the general color shade. So if we move under basic correction here and we grab our saturation, this will show you how these scopes work here. I grab saturation and drag it down. Look at our saturation over there on the vector scope. So I drag it down to where there's zero saturation. Everything sucks into that little point, and if everything sucks into that little point, you basically are left with no color. This is a black and white image. It's a grayscale image now with zero color. If you grab your saturation and drag it out, this is intensifying that saturation. And now look how overly saturated the image is. So it still has the same colors that are in the bricks and the lights and the hair and the blue light coming outside, but now it's just more intensified. One thing you've got to be familiar with when color grading is also legal limits, what they call legal limits. Now with the vector, with the waveform, you have legal limits of 100 and 0 IRE. Most engineers in the industry for broadcast industry, this mostly comes from the broadcast industry when they're preparing shows on tape to air over the television set. They would check the calibration on the movie or the commercials that were showing, and they would double check to make sure that they would not reach these limits of 0 and 100. It was actually a safety feature in that if they reached those limits, the TV would oftentimes roll. If it was brightness levels, the TV would have rolling problems. You'd see it like an actual roll on these old cathode ray tube televisions. So these IREs were set to make sure that they didn't exceed those. And saturation, what you got when you reach saturation limits is you had bleeding. You'd have color channel bleeding and color separation. A lot of people still want to create that kind of that VHS look where they do that intentional effect of color separation to make it look like an old VHS camera. But with those older formats, that's what these were created for. But now these have been adopted by the movie industry just as, I wouldn't know so much as legal standards as much as suggestions. So over here in the vector scope, when we're dealing with legal limits, these here are image legal limits up here. That's your limit for red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and so on. But out here, these are legal limits for graphics. Graphics have a higher tolerance of intense colors, and they support intense colors. But when you oversaturate an image, you start looking like this. And this is kind of giving you a warning here. Typically, when you're saturating an image, about 1/3 to half of the way out, you're going to start seeing too much saturation in your image. And see, that's a little bit beyond. And some of them have higher tolerance levels, like magenta is further away than blue is. So yeah, so some of them will have higher tolerances than, by their very nature, than other colors up here on your vector scope. So the vector scope is used to measure two major things: your general hue of your image and your saturation. You're prayed. Now you probably recognize this sort of shape here. You saw the kind of the similar shape when we were looking at the waveform. This is basically image from left to right. That's your complete image right there. But this is in what we call the red channel. With any video camera that you're using these days, pretty much every camera that we use these days has what records your image in 3 different color channels. Now, your image sensor in your camera will have certain photo sites that are sensitive to just red colors. But they're not just sensitive to just red colors, but they're sensitive to different levels of hue, saturation, and luminance in your red channel. And that's what this basically is here. This was measuring 2 major things here. And this waveform here is measuring basically the luminance of the red colors in your red channel here. And this is measuring the luminance of your green channel from left to right of your image, and this is measuring the luminance levels of your blue channel. When you composite all 3 of those together, you basically get a full color image. Oftentimes, if you go to, in fact, we can even go to curves here, and we can choose the green channel, and we can turn the green channel completely off. Now we're left with the red and blue. We can grab the red, and we can pull down the red, and we're left with the blue channel. And then look at this. We've got our blue channel left, and it's just showing our blue values and darkness, brightness, and notice the blue channel is darker than the red. As we restore the red, and we bring down the blue maybe, then the image seems brighter. So the red channel is more prominent in this image. It's more prominent and dominant in this image, and it's brighter as well. So the luminance levels are brighter in the red channel. If we go up and if we grab the red and drag that down, and we grab the blue and drag it down, we're left with the green channel, and the green channel seems like it might be just as bright or brighter than the red channel as well. So what happens when you have other channels that are brighter or more prominent over others, you get to generalize what we would call balance. This shot is balanced more toward the reds and greens than it is the blue. Let's go to our exposure here. I'm going to pump up the exposure, and I'm going to add a little contrast here, and I'm going to actually darken the darks in this shot here as well. Give a little bit more contrast so we can kind of see this image a little bit better. Now if we looked at our vector scope here and we kind of look at the general, looks like with the window spikes right there, we have more of a blue prominence in the window. But then as we move over to the middle of the room, look at this, the red is higher and the green is just slightly lower than the red. And then look at the blue, this kind of similar shaped mountain. This is lower than the red. And then the spikes kind of go off into the blue again. But look, this channel is more prominent, and the green is a little more prominent than the blue. Therefore, this shot is not necessarily balanced. When a shot is balanced, your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channels are kind of in a similar area, and then the color will end up looking proper. And this shot looks like it's probably a little bit more warm to me. So if we try to bring up that blue channel a little bit, let's do this and grab our slider, temperature slider here, and we're going to pull down the reds and push up the blues a little bit. Look how that cools that off. So you look at the before and after on this. See how it kind of takes that red, a little bit of that red out of that shot there? See, if we pull it further over, then of course you start getting more of a dominating blue channel. But as they get in the middle, your color looks like it is properly balanced or properly color balanced. If we add, let's bring down the green a little bit and get these kind of even. And there you go. So this scope is really good to help you color balance your shot so your colors look accurate. So your shot doesn't look too orange, doesn't look too blue, doesn't look too green. And that's where these scopes really help. But let's move over to this panel right here. This is called the Lumetri color panel. If you're not seeing this, you might be in the editing layout or the assembly layout. Right now you would need to be in the color layout. You hit color. If you don't see these bars up here for some reason, you can go under window and hit them here under workspaces at the top, and then you can choose the color layout. These are customized ones that I've made myself. You won't have as many here unless you've been making them for you. Ryan default. Who the hell's Ryan? I don't even know a Ryan that does editing, so I don't know where that came from. Somebody broke into my house in the middle of the night named Ryan and did his own layout. Let's see what it looks like. That's really weird. Okay, now that I'm creeped out a little bit, I'm going to move over to the Lumetri color panel and talk about this. All right, first of all, I'm going to go up here. I've done a little bit of color grading on this. I'm going to clear this, by the way. I'm going to go up and hit this little reset key, which will reset the entire grade. So everything, now notice everything's kind of in the middle here. You don't have any of these sliders that are slid around right like that, anything like that. Everything's neutral right now. But this is separated into all these different little drop-down menus here. You've got basic correction, you've got creative, you've got curves, you've got color wheels and match, and you've got HSL secondary and vignette. So if you click on any one of those, it'll drop down the entire menu for that area, and we're going to talk about these one by one here. Keep in mind that as you play through your project and you're in the color, once you're in the color arrangement, your playhead suddenly does this. Whatever one you put your mouse over, it selects it will select the video that the playhead is over, and that way it's going to. This is basically real-time adding an effect to your clip. When you decide to grab one of these and you drag it to one side or the other, we just added an effect to this. In fact, you can see that if we zoom up here and look at this little effects tab right there. Let's in fact make sure. Right now it's got this added. I'm going to show that in a minute, but right now there's no effect added to this at all. If I go up and I slide this to the right, watch what happens to this. Let's see this little green FX tab right there. Watch what happens to that. Suddenly this has changed colors. That's like a little magenta color there or something. Now this clip has an effect added to it. If you select any clip and go up to the effect controls, it shows what effects have been added to a clip. First of all, the motion tab. This is just a native tab. It's always there. It's always on every clip. The opacity tab as well. You cannot delete these. You can reset them, but you can't delete them. But now we move down a little further. I'm going to collapse these. And the time remapping as well. These three are native to the clip right there. Motion, opacity, time remapping, native to every clip. But this is an effect that has now been added to this clip simply by moving the sliders over here. So I'm going to select this, delete it. Now watch this as I move this. See, all of a sudden it just adds that effect to this clip, because now these are the numerical versions of your visual sliders over here. If we arrow down our basic correction and watch this, see temperatures move to 29.93 and over here 29.93, but you also have this visual slider. Look at these numbers, how they move in sync here to here. So this effect that's now been added, anything you do over here will affect that specific effect over here and change the color of your image. You also want your playhead over your image so you can see the changes that are being made real time. If I move my mouse over this one, but I happen to move over and select this one. See, they did automatically select this one, but now I did an override and selected this clip over here. And now look, I'm changing my clip here, but I don't see anything changing. So if I brighten this way up, do heavy contrast, highlights, everything, I'm smashing the heck out of the shot, but you can't tell because right now I have this selected. If you move your playhead over and look at that, oops, I've destroyed my shot. See, all these sliders changed the shot that was selected. Reset that. In fact, let's just select this Lumetri color panel, delete it. All right, let's talk about this panel over here. So I'm going to work on this first, or just have my my playhead over this first shot here. And see, this shot from a previous episode has a warp stabilizer added to it, so it already has an effect added to it. All right, so basic correction. Let's talk about how this panel works. As we move down here, you have input LUT. This is if you're shooting in a very, very flat log format like C-Log, S-Log, V-Log, whatever you're using. That is a very flat profile. We talked about flat profiles. This is a fairly flat profile. This is actually red film log, which is fairly flat, but not very as flat as some of those log footages get. If you're shooting in log, the reason why people shoot in log is so they can it preserves the highlights and the dark levels. It doesn't destroy a lot of the details and the highlights in the dark, so you can decide where you want those later on. So the input LUT deals with if you are dealing with a certain type of log, you can install it right here before you start. It only has a few in here. You can install new ones if you get a custom log. And what the LUT does, LUT is called a lookup table. It basically just gives a certain look to your image. And this kind of gives, and selecting one of these will, like the Rec 709, this is for Alexa, so this is going to be a little bit different than red. But you click on that and look how it darkens, it contrasts everything up, gives a certain level of saturation. That is the Alexa LUT right there. And there's going to be other ones here as well. Let's try. And then each one of these is going to give you a different look. You have to kind of look these up online to see what these are doing. But if you shot on a Sony or a Canon, you can have to look up some of their LUTs and install them for yourself if you want an input LUT. An input LUT does it before you actually start grading. It's just it kind of gives it more contrast and saturation before you actually start doing the grade. But you can do all that down here as well. You don't need the LUT. It just saves you a little bit of time sometimes. All right, as we move down, white balance. And you actually have this white balance selector. If you have something that's white in the image that still has detail to it, you can select on this white balance. And remember we talked to the Lumetri scopes, we talked about color balance. If the white is reflecting more red or green or blue color, it's going to compensate by changing these sliders. Right now I don't really have anything white in here. If I click on this, maybe, I don't know, maybe the pages here of a book. Let's try to click on the pages of the book there. See, and this is reading that it's a little bluish, probably from this light hitting from the outside window. It gives the compensation with a little bit of red, but I don't really have anything white in this image right now to automatically read that. But what does temperature and tint do? These are two basic sliders where they have complementary colors, kind of blue and kind of the teal and orange, and then the magenta green here. Sliders, if you grab the temperature slider, slide back and forth, it's going to push more toward the blues. If you push it the other way, it's going to push more toward the reds. So we mentioned how this shot was too red before, so if we push over toward the blues, then it corrects it a little bit. Now the green magenta, the green channel is too high. You can take it more toward the magenta and get rid of, and kill some of that greenness in the image as well. So we have the magenta green slider and the blue and orange slider for basic correction. Primarily used for color balancing your shot if the color balance looks off. Reset that back to normal. Tone. The definition of tone is basically luminance levels. When people talk about skin tone, technically they are, well, a lot of people think they're talking about color, but oftentimes what the term skin tone is actually referring to is the darkness of the skin. How light the skin is, how dark it is, it basically refers to brightness levels. And if you look at tone, it's the same thing. Tone here is exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, dealing with luminance levels more than color. I'm going to bring up just my waveform here and talk about the IRE scale here. Basically, these sliders affect certain portions of your image here. Now, blacks and whites are kind of the two extreme, and blacks are going to be down near around from anywhere from 0 to about 20 IRE. The whites are going to be from about 80 to 100 IRE. That's where it's going to mainly affect those levels. It's up in those levels with these sliders. Exposure is going to be the mids around 40 to 60. Shadows are going to be around 20 to 40. And highlights are going to be around 60 to 80. But the whites and the blacks, as far as Adobe defines it, are the ones that are on the extreme at the 100 and 0 levels. I should say 0 to 20 and 80 to 100. So if we mess with exposure, that's only messing with kind of the overall exposure of the image. Highlights, look at this, how this just kind of stretches the upper portion. It's kind of messing with that portion of your image. Whites are going to do the very tippy top. See how we can get the very tippy top up there? Blacks is at the very, very bottom, so it's going to drag the bottom stuff down. And shadows is going to get the lower portion right before the blacks. So you have some basic sliders here helping you to be able to adjust tone. And at the very bottom of the image is going to be saturation. If we look at our vector scope YUV, and we grab our saturation slider, you can see that the hue is not changing. It's just boosting and blooming the saturation, these colors, out toward their regions. It's pushing the blues off toward the blues, the yellows toward the yellows, and we tend to have a very yellowish shot here as a result. And if you drag this down the opposite way here, you're basically going to pull all the color out until there is no saturation. So that's the basic slider. Creative. In my opinion, they should have this at the bottom because usually the creative tab is something you can kind of do. When we finish with this project, I'll show you a practical explanation of this. But this is basically to add a look to your film after you're done color grading. And as you arrow through these, you have different looks for your movie. These are LUTs. These are ones that have pre-programmed lookup tables, things that have been programmed already. A template that you just basically click on. Look at this. When I click on this one here, it basically adds that LUT to your image. And look at the saturation. These things kind of come across very contrasty, very saturated as well, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can destroy your image as well. You can either arrow through these and choose one like this, and hit through these arrows so you see one that you like, and then just click on it and it will change it to that LUT. Or you can pull down this list, and if you know what you're looking for, you can quickly scroll down to the one you want. Red Wave, I don't know what that is, but that's, Noir Red Wave. You have different noirs down here. But yeah, usually this is kind of the last step that you do to your color grade is working with a look. And then you also have these intensity sliders up here. Let's give this more of a contrasty look. There we go. You have this intensity slider that controls that. Once you add a look, say you like that look, but it's too intense, you can turn down the intensity and get it exactly where you want to. This shuts it off. This makes it more extreme. So you can drag this down to you say, I like it right about there. Should we set that? Down here they have some other interesting kind of look adjustments here, like faded film. If you have an image that's very, very contrasty, this faded film look kind of pulls up. It doesn't really like kill the overall comparative contrast as much as it kills. It just adds this kind of wash to it. It's a little weird the way this works, but it adds this little wash to make it look like kind of old film. You have the sharpen tool here if your image is, and this you have to kind of look at really close to see. Let me drag this sharpen way over. Let's look at this and look how it's sharpened the edges of your image. I'm going to do undo and watch very closely to the edges here. And see, now it almost looks blurry because it feels so soft. And you can actually soften that up more by dragging it down negative like that, and it actually does end up softening up the image. So if an image is too sharpened, you can de-sharpen it a little bit. If it's not enough, you can just sharpen it just a little bit and make it seem a little more crisp. Now, vibrance is an interesting little feature, and I've heard that this comes from Photoshop. I'm not sure. I'm not a big Photoshop person, but I believe people what they tell me. Anyway, the vibrance is basically boosting saturation in the lower saturated images. This is one thing they kind of included the vibrance for us, so you can increase saturation in things that are kind of that will not in the lower saturated portions of the image without oversaturating skin tones, essentially. So drag this up. In fact, if we kind of go over to one where we can see skin tone here, and let's go basic correction, just quickly get a little bit more exposure, a little bit more contrast, a little bit more just general saturation on this image here. And that's looking a little greenish. Let's go a little more magenta. We'd have to really look at the scopes to look at the skin tone there. But now let's go to our vibrance under creative here. We grab the vibrance and we drag that up. You see it starting to kind of get these the saturation in these lower saturated areas where it is not affecting the skin tone until you start really boosting up. Then I can see it starting to affect it. Vibrance will also kind of maintain a level of skin tone and a little bit of color in it if you drag it all the way down. It's looking black and white, but it still has just kind of hints of tones and color tones in it. So kind of an interesting little feature there. But basically this increases saturation on the items that are already less saturated in the image and leaves the things that are already saturated kind of alone is the idea. Saturation is the overall saturation of your entire image. This is an additional slider here. Just make some adjustments. If you do a look, it makes some adjustments based on your look that you've added. As you go down, you can change colors in your. Sometimes you'll have like blue colors in your highlights or blue colors in your darks, or the red, or opposite. You might have red colors in your darks or in your highlights. And this helps with your shadows in your highlights to change kind of the tint. If you got kind of a bluish tint in the highlights, you can drag these off more. You can warm those up, the darks up, and then you can cool off the highlights and make it look more like. And this will kind of emphasize these kind of highlights. The blue in the highlights will red in the darker tones of your image there. And tint balance just kind of shifts the general image of the general tint of the image in the ways that we meant before. Tint is basically the green magenta slider, so that's kind of changing more of the green and magenta colors in those areas there. I don't tend to use these a whole lot when I'm really trying. I found that the curves are a lot more powerful, especially when you're trying to affect the shadows. We'll get into that and kind of show you later on. But for now I'm gonna hit this reset and reset my entire Lumetri panel here, and we're gonna go down to curves. This is where a lot of the power exists within color grading is within your curves. The basic correction is just what it says. It does the basics of color grading. This is where you really get into some really powerful features here. The way a curve works here is you basically you'd almost have to imagine, and I like that Resolve does this. Resolve puts a histogram across this of your image, and the histogram really helps you to see what you're grading. That isn't something they've added until recently. Before it was just kind of the same curve here. But what this does, just a quick layman's explanation. This node down here is your darks node. And then if you drag it over to this side of your image here, if you look at the bottom here, the whole bottom here is basically your kind of dark region down here, and this whole upper region is your highlights region. Now this is your dark node, this is your highlight node, and in between, if you think of a gradient like your IRE, you go from 0 all the way up to mid-gray, which is 50, and then all the way up to 100. So this is your gray level right here as you're moving along this line, and this is telling it what to affect. If you want to affect your darks, your mids, your highlights, you can click and add a node onto it and affect those. Now this is the, let's call it the turn it up region, and this is the turn it down region. So basically anything you drag down here, it's going to turn it down. Anything you drag up here is going to turn it up, make it brighter. So brighter up here, darker down here. And I'm going to double click on this node here, reset it here, take that node away. Now watch what happens when we grab our dark slider and we drag it to the right. This and let's also do this. Let's bring up our waveform here. So our waveform, look at the waveform, look at the image as we drag this across. It starts bringing down the darks first until it hits the bottom, and then it just slowly starts crushing everything else. If you drag it all the way to the right, everything is crushed. If you grab your highlights, it'll bring the highlights down first. Look how it's grabbing the top of the image first and then pushing it down until it eventually starts to flatten it, and then it brings everything down to 0 and flattens it. So it's doing it by the highlights first. This is doing it by the darks first. If you grab this and drag it up, it increases the darks. We bring this down. Here, this decreases the whites. So we showed you where we could bring this to the middle and you create this like perfect gray right here in the middle. This perfect mid-gray in the middle, because the darks have been redefined as middle gray, the whites have been defined as middle gray, and there you go. So where this is really helpful is to really fine-tune and mess with contrast and luminance levels here. So what we can do is we can move up a little ways, and we're going to go to about 25% grays here. We can put a node and we can grab this and we can redefine those darks as darker. Now we can move up the scale here and maybe move around like 75% gray, and we can grab these and increase them to highlights there. And this is creating what they call an S curve. This S curve now creates the shape of an S, and you're going to create contrast based off of this. Let's first of all, this will be easily demonstrated because right now this is a very flat image. So I'm going to go to my basic correction and spread that out a little ways. Spread out our contrast, bring up our exposure a little bit, and make this a little more contrasty. So there we go. Let's bring up the exposure a little bit more. Now we've got a little bit more levels to deal with. Let's go to our curves. Now watch what happens. We grab the darks down here, we drag them down, and we grab the highlights and drag them up. We create more contrast. Now look at that spread we have between the darks and the highlights, as opposed to, let's turn this off right here. This turns the whole effect off. And look how flat, and then look how contrasty. And see what the difference is, and we've created a little S curve. But you can really, if you're having trouble, if you want to darken the darks but like leave the face alone, look what you can do. You can grab your darks and drag them over, and we can kind of find where that face exists, and then we can bring up the elevation on the face there. And then it's dark, and it has kind of this curve as it slides off and leaves the face values alone while darkening the darks. Right here we've crushed it, so we've basically crushed our details, but that's what our curve does. Now you also have access, this is your luminance channel right here. If you select an individual one, now you have access to just the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. We've kind of shown you this already, how you can bring down the blue and then you're left with the green and the red, and vice versa. We can bring down the red. But if you got like issues where you're getting too many blues in the highlights, you can just grab the blue channel here, bring down the blues in the highlights up at the tippy top here, and maybe boost up the mids here. Keep the mids where they are while boosting down the highlights and killing kind of the blue highlights there. So you got a lot of control there in the curves, especially when it comes to accessing individual color channels, the luminance levels in each individual color channel. Right. These curves are something they've added in the past like year or so. I can't remember when they added these, but these are really, really cool. I've been impressed with these curves, and I've been complaining about Premiere over Resolve, saying Resolve's got a better this and that. Well, this is where I think Premiere has something better than Resolve, and they do have these curves inside of Resolve, but this one I really like because it's got this little slide bar right here. Because you're going to add a curve on these things here. I'm going to demonstrate what these do, but if you add several points, you can create a curve on adjusting certain colors. But on Resolve, if it's on the end, if it's on the very end, your curve kind of moves over and comes over to the other side of the screen here. And if you don't like that, if that's annoying, you can just slide it over and say, "Well, be right there." And I like that a lot more. So Premiere has one thing on Resolve. So there you go. All right. So I double click on those dots to refresh them back to normal here. But what these do, these are verses here. These are hue saturation curves. You've got hue versus saturation, hue versus hue, hue versus luminance, lumen versus saturation, saturation versus saturation, and all these curves here. So what these do individually here, first of all, hue versus saturation. So when you're using the verses, basically this is what's going to be changed right here, is the saturation within a specific hue. So if we, let's grab her, like some color in her face right there. I'm going to grab this eyedropper and click right on the face there, and what this does is it adds 3 dots. The center dot is the color range that this chose right here, kind of this reddish color range. And then this is a kind of a soft point. As it comes from this point, it softens off through these reds and softens off through these reds so they gradually doesn't turn red. It turns yellow, turns blue over here, but it kind of puts 2 dots before it changes, goes too far outside the red realm. You grab this middle one here and you drag down, and if you start dragging and you hold shift, once you grab this here, if you hold shift and start dragging down, it'll lock it to that middle point there. It won't let you waver back and forth like this, but hold shift as you start dragging down, it'll lock it to that point. Look what happens as we drag this down. It's basically desaturated all the reds out of her face. So that's taking it down. Notice this is saturation, the saturation line. The top is fully saturated, the bottom is desaturated. Notice how it's gray at the bottom and very red at the top. So if we boost this up, it boosts its saturation in that color. If we drag it down, it desaturates it, takes it down, takes it away. So if something is kind of bleeding saturation in your image, if you have a very specific color, let's say this color, I'm going to intentionally saturate this image, but let's say the camera shot it and it looks very saturated like this. What we can do now is we can go and choose this, and look at how the face is kind of bleeding that color there. In fact, let's go to our Lumetri scopes here. Let's go to our scopes over here and show our YUV vector scope and show you, see how this is kind of bleeding saturation towards the yellows and reds. If we choose that saturation on our face there, and we go to this middle dot and drag it down, hold down shift, look how that's bringing in just that, especially right along that line right there. It's just bringing down mostly the reds, somewhat towards the yellows image there. And if we increase this, if we drag this over, look how it starts affecting more regions of reds, more regions of yellows, and it's desaturated, and it does this on a curve basically, because if we want to add another point and bring it down on the yellows, bring it down, you can really bring down a lot of saturation and leave a very specific image that's saturated. In fact, with some of these you would probably be able to achieve that look where somebody has a super red lips and everything else is desaturated. Anyway, let's turn this back to normal here. Going to double click on one of these dots and this will turn that scale back to normal. Move down to the hue versus hue. Hue versus hue will select a very, I'm going to keep this saturated for intentionally to kind of demonstrate this. If I choose a very specific hue, like let's choose the pants here. Very blue hue. Notice how it shows the blue over here. And we grab that blue and we start dragging it up. Look what it starts doing to the blue jeans. It starts changing them. This is a hue line now. This hue line goes from green to blue to magenta to red to green. It's got the whole range here as you slide it up and down to yellow, and it will change the color of that saturation. And you can widen the amount of area that you're saturating by increasing this area here, and you can add even a couple nodes if you want to and bring these up and increase a big area that you want to change the saturation in. So you have a lot of power up here, but usually this is just used to just kind of maybe make the skin tone look a little bit more skin tone-ish, which we will get into. Clear that. Hue versus luminance. This is going to change the luminance on a specific hue. If we go over and select it once again, kind of the face. If we get our eyedropper here and put it on her face and get that, let's scroll this over a little bit so we can see what we're messing with here. But now that luminance on our face there, that hue on our face, as we drag it down, it's going to darken it or it will increase the brightness of it. And if we're getting pretty destructive here, if we bring that up, we just want to brighten the face a little bit, we can just drag it up and now her face is brightened. And keep in mind, all these dots and everything is because I saturated the crap out of this thing, and it's really starting to destroy the image. I kind of overdid it there. Lumen versus saturation is going to take the saturation in a certain luminance level. You can decrease the saturation in a certain luminance level. Let's me get this, let's move to this image here. We have kind of dark, a little more, we can see more dark regions. Let's bring the exposure down a little bit. Now we can go to the curves, go to Luma versus saturation. We're going to choose the darks here, and say you want to kill the saturation in the darks here. You want it to be kind of gray so it just looks dark. We can bring down these nodes here, and that will bring down the saturation in those dark levels right there. Let's see kind of before and after. See, I can see a little color hue in these darker areas, and now when you do this, look how it just grays those areas up. It's very subtle, but it is doing that. You can increase the range, but eventually it'll get into the mid levels. If you move it over, then now it's doing the mids, and now it will do it to the highlights as well. Saturation versus saturation. If you choose an area that is a certain level of saturation, and you want to increase the saturation in that luminance level there, you can do that as well. So in this tool, I have not found a bit specific purpose for this. This actually is bringing out the color of the couch really nicely there, making it very blue, which I like. It's kind of increasing the saturation, and you can see that happening over here. Move down to the next one, color wheels and match. Color wheels and match are really nice, especially if you're matching two people's faces. I only have one person's face in this image right here, but you can use it against other images as well. Let's do, what we're going to do here is I'm going to do a basic correction here on this image. You've got your luminance sliders. This is your shadow luminance sliders here. This is your midtones. I'm going to bring up the midtones and bring up this is just luminance levels that we're messing with, nothing color. And then let's define the highlights just a little bit more there and bring those up. So that's the luminance highlights, the midtones, and we've created some contrast by these sliders here. And now let's work on color hue. Let's kind of shift the hue a little bit off into this direction here, warm up the face a little bit, warm that image up a little bit. And let's say that's the image. I like that image right there. And now there's another shot here as we move along. This is the exact same shot, so we just only have to copy and paste it to this one. But I'm going to move this to a close-up, which is a different framing here. They frame her on the couch under the same lighting levels right here. So this is kind of cool here. What you've got, well, first of all, when you're just grading, you've got your comparison view. You hit your comparison view, and it's got on the right the image that you are grading. So here I can start grading this image here. I can darken the darks, mess with the midtones, etc. I'm just going to undo that right now. But over here you've got a reference monitor. This is your mini timeline. This is a duplicate timeline here that basically shows your timeline. And I'm going to say I want to match it to this shot. This is really cool because now when you're grading this shot, you have something to compare it against. You can start saying, okay, I need to get more color in her face because look how white her face is there. So I can grab this and boost more color into the shot there. And I can keep trying this, but there's an easier way to do this. Right now I'm going to leave face detection on. I'm going to undo what I've done here, get these back to normal. But you can double click on these and get them back to normal. And by the way, when you start moving something here, it will fill in the circle and say there has been an adjustment done on the midtones hue wheel here. If you double click, clears it, and now it's got this open gap in the middle. And see, look at this. Now that's been changed, because it's filled in. That's just how it shows you that something's been changed in those areas. And the open circle means it hasn't been done yet. This, when you slide it, it turns blue. When it's white, it's neutral. All right, so I'm going to go to apply match. What it's going to do is going to read this one and try to get this one to look just like that, and it will detect the face and get the face the same tones here. And look at that, that did a pretty good job. It's not as contrasty, but that's a good starting point. So now all I have to do is maybe decrease the shadow here. The shadows make it a little more contrasty, and maybe increase the midtones. But look what it did. It adjusted all these colors here on these wheels, the highlights, the midtones, the shadows, to get these two shots to try to get them to meet a little bit. And then you might have to just do a little bit of fine tuning to get them to meet. But yeah, look at the before and after here. Before and after. And that's much better. Sometimes when I'm having trouble matching faces, that really helps here. HSL Secondary. HSL Secondary is where you get the most powerful option to grab a specific color vector and just affect that color vector. So we can go to our secondaries here. If you're trying to just kind of highlight the sky, or maybe the blues out of this couch, or the reds in the wall, that's where secondaries help. And this has a hue, saturation, luminance slider. It can choose a range of colors based on hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue is going to be that generalized color. You can hit your set color here, and it will create what's called a key, which is basically going to just key out the portion of the image that it's going to be using. And I'm going to select the range of the blue on the couch here. Let's say we're trying to emphasize the blue on the couch. So it chose this range right here from here to here on this blue scale by clicking on that. And also what it did, this is a feather here. It basically gradually feathers off of that, so it's not such a hit. It hits this point and then it's done. That way this avoids getting like noise and bouncing in the transitions from one color to the next. You have your little plus button here. You can go. These are general color areas right here. I kind of don't like using those. I usually use the eyedropper. And I'm going to go over here and choose a darker blue as well. And that chose a wider range of blue, a wider range of saturation, and a wider range of luminance. I'm going to choose this down here. This color gray will show me what it is choosing. Keep in mind, this is a compressed image, so we are getting some noise in here. This is not the original red footage. But now you can grab your sliders here and increase the range of hue, saturation, and luminance. If we're trying to just get the couch here, finally I can kind of get all the couch. It's sharing the colors with their jeans right there. But now to clean this up, you can move down to denoise. Denoise is going to clear up some of those white spotty noises. Now blur is going to soften this mask so you're not seeing it bounce and dance as much. But with the compression, it's really going to be hard to kind of choose all the couch here. You can slide this around here until you get as much as that couch as possible. See, I'd say don't get the shady parts right there and just get the more prominent blue parts right there, and you won't notice as much noise. Saturation, let's see. That's not changing much. You can slide these back and forth and see what gets you the most amount of couch. Same as the hue. And once you get as much as the couch as possible, that's all it's going to grade in that image and nothing else. So I'm going to turn that off. And now we can move down here. And based on this mask that I've chosen, those items right there, it's only going to affect those colors. If I grab my correction here and grab it toward the blues, look how it's making the couch look more blue and not the girl, not the walls. Or if we make it look more green, red, whatever color you want that couch to look, you can change that now. Let's say we want the couch to look very blue. And we want to make everything else gray. We could actually do this. This is a mask inverse. I'm going to click that, and it will now inverse the mask, and what I affect now will affect everything but the couch now, which is kind of cool. So if I go down to my saturation, here's that kind of Sin City look that we're talking about. When you make just the lips red, we're going to desaturate everything else but the couch. And now say we want to emphasize the blues on that couch, you can actually we'll show you how to make another color panel later, but I'm going to add a Lumetri color effect. Now I've got 2 up here, 1, 2, and on the second one, and I will go under basic correction and increase the blues here, and now it will make the couch look very blue and everything else look like it's black and white. Anyway, that's just kind of the basics of that. But that's what your HSL secondary does. It usually is used to help kind of make maybe the sky pop, or make the greens in the trees pop, or make skin tone pop. That's where, but you have a lot of power over choosing what portion of your image you want to affect by using your HSL secondaries. And that is called actually secondary color grading. All right, last thing here on the color panel is the vignette. This is kind of cheesy. I don't know how much I like the vignette because you don't have a lot of control over it. Vignetting is used quite often in color grading, but it is used mostly to emphasize a certain portion of the screen. Adobe just has a kind of a basic vignette that you can do. Let's kind of add a contrast to this, just make it look a little better. But the vignette, watch what it does. If you drag it one way, it feathers to the darkness. If you drag it the other way, it does a white vignette. This almost looks like a dreamy flashback or something. You have a midpoint you can adjust. You have the roundness, which will change the shape of it. And then you have the feather, how soft the edge is, or how hard-edged it is based on the feather. But usually if you do see a vignette, it's more like this. It'll be very feathered. And let's change it right there, where it just kind of emphasizes everything in the middle. It makes it kind of redo a little bit of the lighting here, where it emphasizes something in the middle. And that's kind of the weakness of this vignette, is it just mostly does it kind of in the middle. And if you do it in a subtle manner, watch this, what happens. See how it's kind of flat up here? It's kind of even coloring. Well, not even, it kind of transitions to blue there. But if we grab this amount and we drag it down like this, and then we feather it more, bring it in a little bit more, it should be just kind of settled. That now it looks like there's kind of a light hitting her hair and it's just kind of darker off the edges. See, look at this. This is without and with. And actually there I think it works pretty well. Sometimes when you see if the camera has a pan or a tilt, it's a dead giveaway that there is a vignette burned onto the image rather than the lighting that's making it look like that. All right, well that is the control panel with the Lumetri color panel there. Now, there's some footage that we've used for the exercise files here is a very, very flat footage. It's very intentionally done. We did that intentionally, so it would have a higher dynamic range, and you could have control over the entire grade. And it helps you kind of show what you can do with a color grade here. What I first recommend doing is because when you color grade, you're going to be color grading every single shot, but you don't have to repeat yourself on the shots that you've already done in the past. Like here, we've got, for example, we've got a wide shot, kind of a long shot. Then we cut to a medium shot. I guess a little bit more of a close-up, getting the close-up range there. Then over the shoulder, back to that medium shot close-up there, that medium close, and back to a full shot here, near a full shot as it moves across the room. But this shot here is the same as this shot here. So the grade for this is likely going to work if we just grade this one and then move that grade over to this one here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to move through this project here. I'm going to do markers here. You got to be careful because right now we are under the color arrangement. If you hit M for marker, it'll put a marker on with the selected clips. If you don't have it selected, it'll put it on the timeline. I'm going to put it on the timeline rather. I'm going to put it kind of like right in the middle of this clip. Deselect the shot. In fact, I'm just going to, actually, before I do that, I'm going to move to editing so it stops selecting those shots for me, so it will just let me do the marker on the timeline rather than the clips. All right, so I'm going to say, all right, here's a wide shot that I'm going to color grade. I hit M, the letter M for marker. I'm going to move over this one. Here's a medium shot. I'm going to hit M for marker. I'm going to move over this one over the shoulder, and then we go back to this medium shot. So this one I don't have to grade again. So far we've got 3 shots we're going to work on. She stands up. This is pretty much the same as as this one over here, so I probably don't have to, so I might not have to work on this one. We have a shot out the window. That's a whole new setup there. Her coming back in, sitting down. These we've already kind of done. We've done that shot. We've done this one. This one's a new one. This is more of a close-up, a full close-up here. So I'm going to hit M for there. So far I've got 5 shots total that I got to grade. Out the window, this one is similar to this one, but a little different, so maybe I'll do that one as an individual grade, but we'll see. We'll get there. We've done that shot. We've got one for that shot. Over the shoulder we've got, and then this is a new shot here, so marker, 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 and then the rest of these is the same shot now that we've seen and the same shot here. So my point being is you don't have to grade every single individual shot. You can grade a handful of shots and then copy and paste those effects to other clips that are basically the same setup, but you're cutting to different timing on those shots there. So I've got those marked there, the ones that I'm going to be working on. First of all, let's work on this wide shot. Now I'm going to go to color, arrange for color. I'm going to bring up my RGB parade. So I've got my three favorite scopes, my waveform, my vector scope, and my parade here. And we're going to start working on luminance first. The way I like to work on luminance, then I like to work on saturation, then I like to work on color balance. And with this one, actually, just so we can see it better, I'm going to turn off the parade and the vector scope, just so we can see our luminance levels. So right now, this is a very flat shot, so I'm going to go into basic correction. Sometimes I will even go under the shot that I'm working on and do this, and kill the saturation completely. So all I'm looking at is the luminance of the channel, and I'm not even worried about the color. So right now our exposure is dim. It's looking kind of, I don't know, for a darker scene it might be fine. I'm going to just bring up the exposure just a little bit, which will also give us some contrast range here. When we grab our contrast, we'll have a higher range for contrast, because if it's toward the bottom, see if this is like really close to the bottom and you start doing contrast, that's going to hit the bottom. It's going to bottom out sooner. So I'm going to increase the exposure just a little bit and grab my contrast slider and slide the contrast and give this image a little bit of contrast. All right, to give this even a little more contrast, I'm going to go to the darks here. I'm going to define the darks, the bottom level. I'm going to get them close to 0. So it really, really kind of defines them as dark. Especially in a scary movie, you want to probably do this a little bit more. Get close to 0, but not quite to 0. Let's see how we do on the highlights. We could bring the highlights maybe down a little bit and boost up the exposure a little bit, so we can kind of keep things nice and dark, and increase the exposure a little bit so we can kind of keep things nice and dark. Let's bring down the whites. Let's bring down the whites, which is the tippy top of the scale, and then increase the exposure here. All right, let's bring our saturation back here. If you double click on it, it brings it back to the neutral area there. And let's look at our before and after here. There's a before, there's our after. It's looking good. See, I'd say I kind of like this a little bit darker though. I'd say I like this a little bit darker though, just maybe right about there. So you're going to kind of use a balance between, so you're going to kind of, and if we're looking through her image and we go through here, she is kind of showing up, her skin tones and everything is kind of showing up around like 30 to 40 IRE. And midtones is the midtone gray. So actually for skin tones and whatnot, that's pretty good. We might even want to darken the shadows just a little bit, just to give more of the creepy vibe. There we go. Let's say I like that level right there. All right, so next I'm going to work on my vector scope here and look at our image. And look at our vector scope. Holy crap, this thing is really oversaturated to the yellows right there. And it's probably just mostly this, it's probably this light there that's really bleeding off into the yellows there. So what we can do here is I can probably decrease the saturation just a little bit until the colors everywhere else start looking kind of normal. See, because even the blues look a little oversaturated and the red, so I'm going to bring that in. So this is kind of like, generally speaking, about 1/3 of the way out, but we still have that light to work with. So now I'm going to go to my curves. All right, so under my curves here, I've got hue versus saturation. I'm going to try to bring down this big push in saturation. I'm guessing it's kind of that light that's causing that. So I'm going to grab my eyedropper and go up here and click right in the middle of the light. And that did tend to choose a little bit of the kind of orange yellowish range. Let's pull this down and see. And that nailed it. Look at that. It's bringing down the saturation. I don't want to kill that warmth altogether, but I want to find out it's a little bit more to the right in the yellows here. I'm going to push that down right there. Open this up so it feathers off a little bit more, and right there. And now we can keep that warm. That light is warm, but it's not glowing yellow. So watch this before as I uncheck this. So it's got that glowing yellow, it's oversaturated, and now that just kind of backed it off a little bit. So our saturation's looking pretty good. Let's look at our balance here. And right now this says my overall image is giving a way heavier push in the reds and a little bit more push in the greens than it is the blues. So our shot, and right now our shot, maybe it looks too warm, especially for being a nighttime scene. So I'm going to go under basic correction here. See if we can kind of fix this in basic correction. I'm going to push this more toward the blues, which will bring down the reds just in a subtle manner. And then the greens, let's bring those up and meet the reds a little bit and see what we get. And that's looking better there. That's not looking so warm. Before it was looking kind of like right about there. But now I'm just pushing it off just to cool it off just a little bit. And I like that a little more. I'm going to bring down the darks just a little bit just to kind of define the dark areas over here. It is crushing it a little bit, but this is like a darker movie, so it's okay to kill some of the details. Usually you don't want to be touching 0 if you want to preserve details, but that's working there, and we could even cool it off just a little bit more. About right there. Now it looks like more nighttime light coming in, like nighttime moonlight coming in. There. Cool, I'm liking that shot there. Yeah, let's look at the before and after here. Let's look at the before and after here. Let's turn off that Lumetri color panel, and let's look at the before and after. That's before, that's after, huge difference. And let's say that's going to be my base shot that I'm going for right there. So when we're comparing things, I'm going to keep comparing things to this first shot, because that's the shot that I want to finish, that I want to use as my modeling shot there. So I'm going to go to, so everything matches from here on out. I'm going to go to my color wheels. I'm going to go to my creative tab. I'm going to grab my sharpen, and I'm going to just sharpen this image up a little bit because it's a little bit soft. Not from focus, just kind of the pixels are a little bit soft. Let me do undo, and I can see a slight and I can see a slight sharpening of the image right there, and I like that. So just sharpened it up a little bit, and now we're going to move on to the next shot. Okay, so we got it where I like to. I kind of balanced. I got my darks, highlights, contrast, fix, saturation, and then the color balance. And I'm going to do the same here. So I'm going to go waveform. If you're working on a bigger screen, you're working on 2 monitors, you won't have to keep turning the scopes on and off. I keep doing it just so you can kind of see what we're doing here. So basic correction, increase the exposure a little bit so we have a higher contrast range. Fix our drag our contrast over. See, if we're not getting enough contrast in this image, we can go to our curves, our basic curves, and do a luminance S curve here. There we go. I like that contrast. Let's increase our exposure a little bit. Right about there. Okay, we can go to color wheels and match, and I'm going to just use this for the comparison view. Click on the comparison view, and I'm going to turn this one to the first shot here. And we can get our playhead and scroll it in there, because the beginning of the shot is fading in. So we can put these side by side and compare them. This is has way more warmth than this does to it. So I'm going to first of all use my scopes here. Let's turn the R. And by the way, I've got my comparison view right here, so you can turn this on and off quickly rather than having to go to the color wheels and match. If this is not showing here, you can go to your plus button, your button editor, and you can grab your comparison view, which is right here, and drag and drop it down here. And hit OK, and now it's there. Now you can have a quick little switch there to turn it on and off, which is helpful. Let's look at our saturation. Saturation seems to be intact. It's not terribly oversaturated, so I might tone it down just a little bit. And then our balance, I seem to remember the other shot had a balance that looked more bluish. We ended up with more of a bluish shot. We ended up with more of a bluish shot than we did the red shot. And this one is pushing more in the reds and greens. So once again, I'm going to cool that off a little bit, push up the blues, bring down the greens there. The greens seem to be a little high. There we go. Let's do a comparison shot, see how they look. This one's looking more contrasty, so I'm going to drag the blacks, drag them down to kind of match the blacks. There. Bring the shadows. Let's see, mess with the shadows a little bit. Exposure up a little bit more. There we go. Okay. So I'm liking that. I'm matching, but the skin tones don't seem to match here for here. So what I can do here is I'm just going to go under my curves here. I'm going to go to hue versus hue. I'm going to select a certain hue and change it to another hue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this eyedropper here. Let's turn off that comparison view for now. And I'm going to select the skin tone right on her forehead as a big obvious skin tone area right there. And I added that skin tone region, which is kind of in the reds here. Sorry, I should say skin tone as much as skin hue. Skin tone is the darkness level of the skin, but right now the color hue is a little reddish. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to drag it a little bit more. Let's go up more toward the reds and down a little bit more, and that's more towards the greens, and then we can just push this up maybe a little bit. Just get a little bit more red, and let's see what we got there as a difference. And see, by pushing that up, we just got a little bit of that kind of glowy red out of it. Now it looks a little bit more natural there, just by slightly changing the hue there in her face. There's before, actually that's got a little more greenish in it, I should say, and now that adds a little more red and kind of offsets the green in her face, and we're getting more of a regular skin tone there. If you want to get really nitpicky with skin tones, I'll show you when we get to the close-up here what we're going to do. But now I'm going to move from shot to shot, and I'm going to keep doing this sort of grading here. I'm going to fix the darkness levels, the contrast, define the darks. If you got highlights that are hitting 100, you'll want to bring them down below 100. You want to work on saturation, the general color balance, and then you'll do the fine nitpicks with curves and or secondary colors. I'm going to show you one here close-up that I'm going to do a little trick with here. So here's my other close-up. Here's my close-up, my more full close-up rather than that kind of medium close-up that we were dealing with there. I'm going to bring this up on the comparison viewer here. Actually, let's do our basic grade before we start comparing. I'm going to go to basic color correction. This looks a lot brighter than the other images. I'm going to bring it down. Actually, let's see if contrast will bring that down a little bit. See, and that's darkening everything else up a little bit, but it still seems a little too dark, so I'm going to bring that down. Maybe the shadows bring down a little bit, and exposure up a little bit to keep that exposure on her face. Let's see how that looks on our Luma waveform. I'm going to go to vector scope now and look at the saturation. Saturation's looking pretty normal, maybe a little push toward the yellow, which might be coming from this blanket right here. So we could kill the saturation just a little bit, or if we want to kill them specifically in those yellows, we can go to our curves, get our eyedropper, see if it's the blanket that's doing it. And it looks like it is in the yellows there that it's kind of doing it, yellow towards the reds. And let's look at our vector scope as we do this, as we try to pull back that specific yellow color right here. It's kind of specking off toward yellow. So let's drag that down. And that doesn't seem to be getting, we need to move it over to the right just a little bit. And make this range move over to toward the right. There we go. Now we're getting that spiky yellow and we're bringing it down so it's not such a yellow glow. Okay, let's bring up our comparison view. And I'm going to compare this actually to our, go from edit to edit up here, right there. And I'm going to scroll a little bit to where she's looking, right there. Now look at the bluish hue that we have to this. We got to go to basic correction, blue this up a little bit. Go down to the blacks and darken our darks in this image here, get the contrast. But look at the skin tone not matching there. What we could do, there's two things we could try here. Let's go to color wheels and match, and I'm going to do face detection. I'm going to do apply match and see what that gives us. That got it closer. That's great. It actually decreased the highlights. It shifted the midtones towards the reds and the highlights. But now, so the overall tone of the image looks good. However, what we want to do is kind of match skin tone now, or skin hue now. So let's go to our HSL secondary. I'm going to show you a way of kind of really honing in on the skin tone there. What I'm going to do up here is under Lumetri, I've got this one Lumetri panel that's been added to this clip. We're going to add another one. Actually, I'm going to rename the one I've used first. I'm just going to call this one base grade. So that's everything I've done on this base grade there, everything I've done on the basic correction and so on. I'm going to go down and say add Lumetri color effect, and we're going to call this one, now it's got two on there, I'm going to call this one, rename it skin tone. We're going to work specifically on skin tone. So this has nothing done to it yet on the second one. That's the first base grade right there, but I'm going to do this on skin tone on its own layer here, and we're going to go under HSL secondary. First of all, I'm going to turn off my comparison view. So we're just looking at this one. I'm going to choose my eyedropper here and click it right in the middle of our forehead where it's really hitting the kind of the skin tones there. I can hit plus here. I can choose some of the darks as well. It chooses a wider range. And now let's go to color gray and show a mask of everything that we've selected and everything that we have. Everything that's in this white, everything that's in this white right there is stuff that we have not selected. But everything that's in color right now is everything that we're going to be changing. We go color black, it shows everything in black that's not being affected and everything in color that we are affecting, and then black and white shows everything in white that is what we're going to be changing. So we want to kind of decrease that. I want to decrease my saturation a little bit so it's not grabbing the walls as much. And the saturation, we just want to kind of get as much as the face as possible and not the walls. Change the feather on these here. And I'll show you another thing we can do to really just kind of hone in on the facial features, on the face skin tone. Because look at the blanket that's kind of sharing skin tone colors with this. All right, once you get that to where you've adjusted this, where we've got as much as the face selected as you can, I'm going to denoise this a little bit. And then I'm going to also blur the matte, just soften it up a little bit. And we're going to turn this back to color gray here. There we go. Now we're getting a little bit more face. Okay, so this line here is also commonly known as your skin tone line. It's actually not technically your skin tone line, but the skin tone happens to line up with it. Can't remember. It's called the I- line. I can't remember what the mathematical reference is behind that. But right now, actually, the skin tone's looking pretty good. It's going maybe a little off towards the red, so we could shift this a little bit. And watch as we shift this skin here a little off to the yellow, so it's more centered. Right there, we just slightly pushed it to the left a little bit, and let's see what we get when we turn that off, and let's look at our before and after. Let's turn this off. It just tends to bring a little kind of that blotchy nature out of it. That seems maybe a little too magenta, so. But especially if your skin tones, if you're having trouble with your skin tones and they're pushed more off to the red like this, or they're pushed more off to the yellow, you can grab your hue here, your hue wheel, and adjust that and push it off more so it's kind of centered there on that skin tone line there. Now, when it comes to skin tone, when once again I keep saying skin tone, but skin tone is referencing the darkness level of the skin, either if it's bright or dark, because everybody happens to have kind of a similar skin hue. It happens to fall right along this line right here. In fact, let's demonstrate that. All right, I've imported a few images here from the interwebs. One of them is our former president, Barack Obama, and depending on when you're watching this, our former or our present president, Donald J. Trump. And then I've brought something in with some darker skin tone here so we can kind of demonstrate the hue of each person's skin here, that we're talking about tone, darkness levels, not color so much. Which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to go to, first of all, let's go to Obama here, and I'm going to create a mask, a opacity mask, and we're just going to put it on a portion of the skin here and show you the color range, the skin tone line, where that should kind of be at. Let's just grab a portion of the skin right there. Okay, and I'm going to go to Trump, and I'm going to do the same right there, and then go to this image here and do the same and show you kind of these differences in skin tone versus skin hue. All right, so we've got kind of three different portions of skin here that we're looking at. Let's go to our vector scope and take a look at these. All right, so Obama, first of all, look at where this hits here. And like I mentioned, the skin, I know I keep calling it skin tone, and I shouldn't be calling it that, but the skin hue is leading off toward the red and the yellow here, right on the line, happens to be right on the line. Usually, this one is probably a little improperly balanced, color balanced. Usually, you're going to get just a little to the right of the red is where you usually get that. So let's take a look at the next one. And this one actually is a little to the right of the red, even maybe a little too much to the red. If it's pointing straight toward the red, that's too much. It should just barely be offset, just barely on the right-hand side of this line. So that's a little too far over, but now let's go over to the next one and look at the same. Even though we got darker skin, this is still a very reddish skin hue. People have a reddish skin hue because you have a little something called blood flowing under your skin, and it emanates a red color off of everybody's skin. You just have different levels of darkness and lightness skin, and that is actually skin tone. To correct it, that skin tone is actually the darkness levels in the skin, while hue, everybody kind of shares the same hue. So yeah, you can use that line to kind of correct your skin tones, get it exactly where you need it, and that one looks like it needs to be. If we push that off a little bit more towards the reds, then we'll get a little bit more color in there. Turn that off, and there you go. Okay, so I'm going to use kind of this first frame here and use that to match everything else, or I can even use this one here. And I'm going to do the same over the shoulder. I'm going to go through and correct all these, kind of using the same steps that I've used, and then I'm going to show you, after I get each one of these ones color graded and matching pretty good, then I'm going to come back and show you the rest of the steps here. Okay, so I've gone through each one of these where I put the marker on these different kind of setups, and I've graded each one of those, and I've tried to match them to kind of meet the look of this first image here. I've been using that as a comparison, and sometimes the close-ups close-ups and medium shots as comparisons. But now what we can do is this is where it gets kind of easy. So I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shots is all I've had to really grade. So I'm going to go to this first shot here. I'm going to go to Effect Controls, and I've only got one Lumetri color under there. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to do Control-C to copy, and then I'm going to move down my timeline and find everywhere where I have one of those shots. Right there's a wide shot. Now all I have to do is Control V or Command V. By the way, when I was on this clip here, I selected the Lumetri color. I do Control or Command C to copy. Then move down to the next one. Right here's the wide shot. Command or Control V, as in Victor, to paste. And it pastes that color, and I'm done. I might have to do some basic controls here or some basic adjustments just because she moves through it. This is it moves into different lighting, and maybe we need to darken this up a little bit or something. But that looks pretty good there. So now I'm going to go to the next wide shot here. Let's find it. This is the next one right here because as she moves around and turns around, this is the same shot. Let's paste this, paste it there. And once again, this might need to be a little darker because she's closer to the window, which is fine. Then I'm going to move to the next shot. That's the wide shot right there. Command V to paste it. Keep moving down. There's another wide shot. Command V to paste. And one more right there. So now I've pasted that on like 4 or 5 different times. It cut back to that shot there. So that first one's done. Let's go to the next one. This is the wider close-up shot. So with this selected, I'm going to select the Lumetri color panel that is on this clip. Command C or Control C to copy. Move down. There's another shot right there, the medium close. Paste it. Looks good. There's another shot of it. Paste it, and I'm going to keep doing that and pasting all those shots that belong to that one, and so on. Now I'm going to do the same to this, and basically I just have to keep doing that. Let's show you the one actually where I had 2 Lumetri color effects applied to it. Was on this one. This is the actual tighter close-up here, the full close-up here. So I'm going to actually look at this. I've got 2 Lumetri. I've got the base grade and the skin tone. I'm going to select both of these right here. I did 2 layers on that, so I'm going to select both of those. And the way you can do that is by selecting the first one, holding down Command or Control, and selecting the next one. Control C to copy. Shift 3 to go to my timeline. Arrow down, arrow down, arrow down. There's the other close-up there. Command V to paste, as in Victor. Paste. That's done. And let's see if there's any other close-ups. That's it. So I've only got a couple other shots I need to do that to now. The over the shoulder there. So let's copy that one. Command C. See if there's any other over the shoulder shots. I think there was one other. There it is. That looks good. Then we have the outside shots. So I'll copy the outside shots, paste those. And this is the only other time she sticks her head out, so paste that on. And then we just have the end 2 shots. This one. Copy the Lumetri, arrow down, paste it here, copy this one, paste it here, and I am done. So then it goes really quickly. After you get just those base grades done on those main shots, then it starts getting easier. You just start pasting. But then what you really need to do is you need to play through your project and just make sure everything matches as it goes from shot to shot to shot, and see if there's any fine-tune adjustments you need to do to get everything to look good. And I would say just watch all the way through it, and if you see some spots where you need to stop, just stop, adjust it, and then move on to the next shot. Okay, finally, one more thing that we can do here. I don't know if it needs it on this project necessarily, but it will on some projects. But what you can do, a little trick here, if you want to give an overall look to your shot, you can do this. You can go down to your project window here. I'm going to go down to the bottom of my project window here, this little new item icon. I'm going to say New Adjustment Layer. I'm going to hit OK. It'll base it on the resolution and your frame rate. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to grab that adjustment layer. I'm going to drop it over basically everything, my entire project here. Aside from the titles, I wouldn't need it on the titles. In fact, this title, let's zoom up here, fades completely out. So let's not put it over the title, because the titles are black and white. That works just fine. But you could put this over your entire project if you want to. I'm just putting it over the storytelling portion. And if you select that adjustment layer, you can go up to the Lumetri color panel, go to Creative, and you can start going through some looks here and see if there's something you want to do to kind of give your image a very specific look. I kind of like that one right there. Keep in mind this is going to be kind of extreme when I click on it. When I click on it, it's very intense. It comes across very intense. So all you have to do now is grab your intensity slider and just adjust it down till you get somewhere kind of in between. So now look at this, and that gives that whole grade to my entire project now. It gives that to the entire project here. And I might want to, and I could even go into basic correction, just turn up the exposure just a teeny bit. And that's just all adjusting on my adjustment layer here. Maybe kill the intensity a little bit more. And there we go. So now when I turn my adjustment layer off, it just gives that kind of little look to it, that little contrasty, kind of coolish look to it. And it does it to the entire movie. Well, that's only if you want to give your entire movie kind of that overall look. You can put it on the entire movie, and it maintains the grades below it, but then it puts this over the top of it. It's kind of like putting a color layer over the whole thing that you've already graded. Not necessary, but sometimes it's kind of nice just to give your entire project a nice look. And if you mess with the intensity slider, you can kind of turn it on and off and get it exactly where you want to. Well, cool. Well, that concludes the tutorial series on this specific short film here, editing the short film, doing sound mix, doing the titles, doing the effect work on it, doing the color grading. If you have any questions, please post them. In the future, I am going to be getting into more basic tutorials on just like how to do effect controls, how to do animation, I'll go into more details on credits and things like that. But for now, that's it. So I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions or comments, please post them.